What's up, kids? How you doing? Back to some Vietnam War class here. Hopefully, last time you got to take a look at the one film I sent you guys, and it's about the French experience in Vietnam. Didn't go well, right? Um, so, I guess if you're following along in our notes, you guys would just be up to about page 4, and we're sort of at the point where the French are leaving, and the future of Vietnam's a little bit of a question mark. So we got to kind of go into that and talk about that a little bit. So, as the French are exiting Vietnam, there's something called the Geneva Conference. Geneva's in Switzerland, it's a city in Switzerland, and that's going to be where they iron out the details of the peace arrangement for the new Vietnam. Um, what essentially happens here is that Vietnam is divided at the 17th parallel, which is roughly sort of around this area here, sort of around that like narrow waist of the country, waistline of the country there. The north is going to be with Ho Chi Minh, is going to be communist. The south, at first, is under this guy named Bao Dai, BAO space capital DAI, Bao Dai. He's sort of like a rich playboy kind of guy. He's, sort of like the emperor, but, I guess in a name capacity, he's like an emperor, but they're kind of past that in terms of the march of history and how people are going to live and vote and stuff like that. So he's kind of in charge for a while, but it ends up defaulting to this guy named No Din Diem. And I'll write that for you here real quick because that's a little bit of a tough name. In fact, with this course, I think a lot of the names are going to be tough in the Vietnamese language. So I got it written up here in the red. No, Din. Actually, this would be pronounced Ziem, like almost like a hard DZ, Ziem. No, Din, Ziem. And look at that, there's a G between the N and no. Do you hear the G? No. It's just No, Din, Diem. So he's going to be really the main guy that runs South Vietnam for the early 60s there. Diem. All right. Now, what's supposed to happen per these Geneva Conference agreements is that there's supposed to be a big election, and the people are all going to vote, and it's going to be one Vietnam, and they're going to settle the question there. How do you think that's going to go in the communist north? How do you think they're going to vote? They're going to vote for communists. They're going to vote for Ho Chi Minh, whether they want to or not, really, because the communist ideal of voting is not really the same understanding of voting that we have here in westernized, free democracy type societies. So we know that. In the South, Diem knows that too. He's not, the wool hasn't been pulled over his eyes. He knows that the communist North is going to vote all communist. I mean, there's no dissent up there. You're not allowed to dissent or have different ideas, or else they just kind of shoot you. Plus, he sidestepped the vote issue because the country, South Vietnam, his country that he leads, really didn't technically sign the Geneva Agreements, so the Geneva Accords. So they didn't have the vote. There was just a North Vietnam, a South Vietnam, and the North was communist, and the South was the free part, and that was it. So they never really had their election there. So you're really kind of getting to the end of the 60s here, and we're going to talk about John F. Kennedy in a few minutes, but Eisenhower is the president of the United States through the 1950s, and he was very reluctant to get involved in Vietnam, even when the French were in there and they were hurting and they could have really used American help, especially in terms of air power in the siege of Dien Bien Phu. Eisenhower just didn't quite get into it. He wanted the following things, and he practically looks like a genius now. But anyway, he demanded that the United States have a coalition of different countries, like a team of different countries to go in to help South Vietnam, which would include the British and would include the French who were currently there. He also demanded that Vietnam would be an independent country, which that runs counter to the French desires. The French are fighting in Vietnam because they want Vietnam to be their colony and they own it. But Eisenhower said, it's got to be its own country. We're not fighting some war so that the French people can own the Vietnamese people. So that was a non-starter for him. And also he demanded that we would have congressional approval. So it wouldn't be just him, the president, ordering soldiers and Marines and airmen and Navy people to go in there, but it would be Congress approved it too. So it makes it more official for us as a country, and it's not just the president doing it. So those were some of Eisenhower's demands, and that's what happened to the country ultimately through the late 50s and into the early 60s, and basically where we stand. So if you look at South Vietnam, there's a lot of different people and religions and all kinds of stuff like that. It's a very, you wouldn't think it, but it's a fairly diverse country in terms of that stuff. The North is just communist Vietnamese. Boom. That's it. There's a certain simplicity of that, which makes it easy for the leadership there to manage their issues and problems and everything. But in the South, you've got a bunch of different people, or groups, and I kind of labeled a few of them here, but this isn't, it's not a complete list necessarily. You've got these guys called Binh Xuyen, B-I-N-H space X-U-Y-E-N. They were basically like gangsters. They were like the mob of South Vietnam, racketeers and all that kind of stuff. A lot of times they end up siding with the Viet Cong as this tragedy plays out here. Below them, I've listed Cao Dai and Hoa Heo, both religious sects. I don't know much about the religion necessarily for either one of those groups, but they had their own paramilitary organizations, right? Like, you know, armed people who would stick up for those religious groups. Diem mostly drives them out of the Saigon area by the 1950s, and they're not really players anymore, or released by the mid to late 1950s. Also, Viet Cong, we're going to get to know those guys really well. That's your communist guerrillas operating in the South. Catholics, you wouldn't think it, but there's a lot of Catholics in Vietnam. I think of like Italy, Ireland, places like that. But because of the French influence over here, a lot of priests came with them, and there were a lot of Catholics in Vietnam. When the country was partitioned, they left the North. Catholics that were in the North left and moved south because communism officially is supposed to be an atheistic type of ideology. Atheistic meaning they don't want you to believe in God or go to church or anything like that. Communist regimes, the leadership of communist regimes does not want any competition. If they say these are the rules, they don't want anybody thinking freely for themselves, saying like, well, those might be your rules of government, but you know, God or my religious faith leads me to believe something else. They don't do that in communist countries. They just get rid of religion. You just can't do it. So a lot of those guys came south. I'd say really approximately 500,000 come south. Buddhists. There's a lot of Buddhists in South Vietnam. It's not necessarily everyone or like the majority necessarily, but it's a very sizable group, especially in some of the bigger cities like Saigon. But they're a pacifistic religion, meaning that they don't believe in violence or war or anything. Sort of like around here, you could say that for the Quakers, right? Like they're in Pennsylvania. But the Buddhists are also like a pacifistic type religion that eschews all violence and doesn't really get into violence. Also, I listed ARVN, A-R-V-N, all capital letters, just sort of an acronym, military. They always do acronyms, right? That's Army of the Republic of Vietnam. ARVN's the good guy Vietnamese army. They're the South Vietnamese army that fought alongside Americans to defend their own country from the communist North and from the communist insurgents like the Viet Cong in the South. So those are some of the groups that we've got playing out here in this kind of, you know, confusing situation. going to read you something about the kind of things that pop up in South Vietnam that wouldn't really pop up in North Vietnam from my handy little book here. It's about I'll get some of this done. Flaming Buddhists is the name of the section here. One of the most enduring images of the Vietnam War is of an elderly Buddhist monk who set himself aflame in protest against the Diem government in 1963. The burning monk, named Thich Quang Duc, became the symbol of a government allegedly unworthy of American support. Long before the quote-unquote barbecue of Quich Dang Duc, as Madame New, the evil brother's wife, callously and foolishly called it, adding fuel to the fire, so to speak, Diem had been plagued by trouble with the Buddhists. It wasn't that Diem was anti-Buddhist. He certainly wasn't. Diem vice president was a Buddhist who told a group of foreign diplomats that the regime could, quote, crush the Buddhist movement against Diem without pity, as was his Minister of Foreign Affairs. His 18-member cabinet consisted of 5 Catholics, 5 Confucians, and 8 Buddhists. Of the 38 province chiefs, 12 were Catholic, and 26 were either Buddhists or Confucians. Some of his leading generals were Buddhists as well. I guess maybe they weren't very good Buddhists. I mean, if they're supposed to be pacifists and they're in the army. But, I digress. So while Diem was not anti-Buddhist, the radicalized Buddhists of Saigon and Hue, Hue's a city, were certainly anti-Diem. Less often reported, but well documented, is that these radical anti-Diem Buddhists were heavily penetrated by the communists. Thich Tri Quang, the most prominent of the radical Buddhist leaders, was never proven to be a communist agent himself, though he was born in the North and had served with the Viet Minh, and had a brother who was a senior official in Hanoi's Ministry of Interior. What has been proven is that communists infiltrated the Buddhist movement, as well as groups who supported the radical Buddhists. If nothing else, the communists and the radical Buddhists shared a few common goals. They wanted the Americans gone, and they wanted Diem gone. The Buddhists objected to Diem because they saw him as an obstacle to peace, even though peace that came from the communists meant religious persecution of the Buddhists ultimately, but also because of parochial issues. They believed that his administration was anti-Buddhist. It is true that the South Vietnamese government was top-heavy with Catholic appointees in relation to their percentage of the population, but this had more to do with the preference of French colonists had shown for the Catholic population than with any prejudice on Diem's part. Catholic Vietnamese were, in general, the best educated segment of the population and the segment with the most experience in government. Moreover, contrary to the impression left by many journalists, South Vietnam was not strictly a Buddhist country. In a country of 15 to 16 million people, probably no more than 3 or 4 million considered Buddhism their religion. Another 4 million were Confucians, 1.5 million were Catholic. The rest of the country belonged to such exotic sects as Cao Dai, Hoa Ha, or were animists, Taoists, Protestant Christians, Hindus, or Muslims. A strong and visible concentration of Buddhists in Saigon gave rise to the impression that South Vietnam was strongly or solely Buddhist. No more than a handful of Buddhist temples out of thousands saw demonstrations against the South Vietnamese government. The flashpoint, so to speak, in the radical Buddhist versus Diem conflict came in May of 1963, when thousands of Buddhists gathered in Hue to celebrate the 2,527th birthday of Buddha. The week before, during the celebration of Archbishop No Dinh Thuc's, that's Diem's brother, 25th anniversary of his ordination, the celebrants flew papal flags for the Buddhist celebration. Papal flags. For the Buddhist celebration, however, the deputy province chief, a Catholic, tried to enforce an old decree prohibiting religious flags from being publicly displayed. Legally, only the national flag of South Vietnam could be flown from any church, pagoda, or other place of religious worship. In Vietnam, flags were enormously potent symbols, rousing even stronger feeling, much more than the Stars of Stripes, due for ardent American patriots, which is why their use was circumscribed by a government edict. In this case, of course, the 1958 law on flag flying appeared to have been applied inconsistently, though the province chief's defenders argued that he reasserted the law because it had been violated during the Catholic celebrations. and the already aggrieved Buddhists now felt even more so. Protests and Buddhist flag waving erupted in Hue, followed by what might be described as a riot. In the confusion of trying to break up the protesters, shots were fired and 9 protesters killed. The actual details of the incident were contested. The Buddhists said they were fired upon in cold blood. The government argued that its troops had first used fire hoses, then blanks, then shots in the air to disperse the crowd, and only opened fire after a Viet Cong agitator set off an explosion or fired the first shots. What is not contested is that 2 days after the incident, the provincial chief publicly apologized to the Buddhists, thousands of whom had gathered to protest the shooting, expressed sorrow for those who were killed, and promised that the government would provide compensation to their families. The American consul in Hue, seeing the event, cabled the embassy, "I believe the crisis is nearing an end." Never to be mollified, Fitz Tri Quang and other militant Buddhist leaders demanded punishment of the officials involved in the incident, the removal of all restrictions on display of flags, and the prohibition against the arrest of Buddhists involved in protests. Buddhist militants didn't expect or want reconciliation. They wanted Diem gone and believed they could wage a propaganda war to that end. The government issued a communique late in May that affirmed constitutional protections of religious freedom and firmly forswore discrimination. It had no effect. Throughout the summer, protests continued. Some were peaceful, some were broken up with tear gas clubs and arrests. The government replaced its top officials in Hue in early June, but that also failed to pacify angry Buddhists. On 11 June 1963, Diem's battle with militant Buddhists escalated out of control. Near the Shao Lao Pagoda in Saigon, a sedan stopped and an elderly monk and 2 younger monks got out. The older monk seated himself on a pillow in the street, while his associates doused him with gasoline. The monk, Quang Duc, calmly struck a match and set himself on fire. With loudspeakers in hand, activist monks told the gathered crowd in English and Vietnamese that Quang Duc was dying to protest Diem's treatment of the Buddhists and refusal to meet their demands. Diem did reach a tentative agreement with some of the Buddhist leaders. In return for ceasing all demonstrations, the government would remove all uniformed government personnel from Buddhist pagodas, agree to let Buddhists fly religious flags outside their pagodas on holidays, and so on and so forth. I'm not going to read it anymore because I don't want to get too bogged down in the reading. But that's one of the most iconic, well-known images of the whole time period here in Vietnam is the Buddhist monk sitting sort of cross-legged. I don't know how those guys do that. I can't sit cross-legged well at all. I wouldn't be very well served if I went back to preschool and had to sit cross-legged on the ground. And he's on fire. He's just sitting there burning. But we'll probably see that in some video at some point. So it talks a lot about this guy, Diem. The Diem government was kind of troubled, but you have to understand they had to deal with a lot of very difficult situations. So who is this guy, Diem? Vietnamese patriot, strong anti-communist. He's Catholic. That kind of goes together. Catholics and commies don't get along real well. Nationalist patriot. He's a bit authoritarian. He has sort of authoritarian tendencies. Like, I'm the boss. You're gonna all do what I say. He's maybe not like George Washington or something like that. So he's a little more of like borderline dictator, I guess, than some of our people in our struggle for independence. But he's really a man of a lot of different sort of complexions. Like the Americans say he's very hard to deal with. He's stubborn. He never does what we say. What do you think the communists said about him? They said that he was a tool of the Americans. He's a puppet government dictator, and he does everything the Americans want. Well, those things clash. So the truth has to be somewhere in the middle. The Buddhists thought he was repressive, of course, right? And also he's got some family members in there. He had to go with people he trusts. So a lot of times here in America or in the Western world, we look at a government or organization that's run by all family members, and we think, like they're just hiring their own family. I think in the situation in Vietnam, This guy's really worried. He could get killed. He gets stabbed in the back, something like that, and he has to get people he literally trusts with his life to be part of his government. So he had No Din Nhu, who is his brother, and the guy's more hardcore than Ziem. He thinks Ziem is soft, that he should come down harder on people who are protesting or any problems that are going on in the South. And also there's Madame Nhu. Madame Nhu is his brother's wife, and this is a hardcore lady. She is very vocal. She speaks English, so you'll see sometimes there you can get American news clips of Madame Nhu, and she's very elegant. She's dressed very nicely and has her hair done, so she tries to be like a fashion icon sort of. Um, but she shoots guns and everything, and she calls the monks. She says that the Buddhist monks are having a barbecue, and she says she'll supply the matches for them. She's a pretty hardcore lady. Um, so she's definitely not liked by the Buddhists, but um, that's kind of like the picture of what's going on in the early 60s. So if you look at the 60s over in the other side of the Pacific Ocean in the United States, what do you really think of with the 1960s? You know, like maybe there's some social changes, a lot of what you would call, I think, idealism, right? We're not doing the right thing because it's easy or because someone told us to. We're doing the right thing because it's the right thing. I think of the civil rights movement, there's a lot of change like in pop culture with music and the way people dressed and acted and stuff like that. Um, Contrast that to the 1950s. In the 1950s was like the beginning of uh, rock and roll, and probably the people that ultimately fought in Vietnam were little kids, right? But the 1950s were a time of conformity. Everyone kind of did the same thing. Um, but in the 1960s, people kind of went different directions. And the 1960 election, which kind of ushers it all in, pits Richard Nixon against John F. Kennedy. Well, so Kennedy wins this election. He ends up being the president of the United States for the early 60s and kind of getting us started into the Vietnam and the Vietnam conflict. And I wanted to read a few quotes from Kennedy right here on this piece of paper and kind of give you a little bit of an idea of what he's striving for and what the nation is striving for. So here's some John F. Kennedy. Let the word go forth from this place and time, to friend and foe alike, that the torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans, born in this century, tempered by war, disciplined by a hard and bitter peace. Here's another one. My fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. And a third one. Let every nation know, whether it wishes us well or ill, that we shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe, to assure the survival and the success of liberty. And the last one. The cost of freedom is always high, but Americans have always paid it. And one path we shall never choose, and that is the path of surrender or submission. So, right there, those are some words from John F. Kennedy that kind of lead you to think that, you know, we're very serious about our own freedom, but also the freedom for other people that, you know, want to be our friends and live free like Americans. So, you get a couple things from that. One, he is the first 20th century president, born in the 20th century, youngest elected president, decorated Navy veteran from World War II. He's a Democrat. He's a very strong anti-communist, Catholic. He was so anti-communist, in fact, that he was actually friends with Senator Joseph McCarthy, where we get the term McCarthyism from. He wrote his senior thesis at Harvard, entitled it Why While England Slept, and that's about appeasement, how some of the countries just sort of turned a blind eye while the Nazis gained power and momentum and ultimately led to World War II. He campaigned in 1960 on something called a missile gap. He believed that the Soviet Union had a superiority in the number and types of nuclear missiles aimed against us. I wanted to shut that. I don't know how accurate that was, but that was something he campaigned on. Also, in terms of foreign affairs, he campaigned on something called brush fire wars. Um, he believed that some of the wars of the future would be these what he called brush fire wars, which are low intensity conflicts, like guerrilla warfare type stuff, like you see in Vietnam. Uh, the president prior to that, Eisenhower, believed in something called MAD, mutual assured destruction. We're pointing nuclear missiles at you, Russia. You're pointing nuclear missiles at us. If you cross this line, it's going to be a big war. But Kennedy thought it might be more low intensity than that. And he's actually credited with starting some of the special forces groups that you see fight in Vietnam, like the Green Berets for the Army and the Navy SEALs for the Navy. So he was probably pretty accurate on that. And lastly, he had struggles too. The Bay of Pigs in Cuba happened during his presidency. That's a failed invasion of Cuba by pro-American Cuban exiles who got essentially kicked out of the country by Castro, trained by the CIA and the U.S. military to go back and take over. It's a huge embarrassment for him. The communists built the Berlin Wall around the city of Berlin, and he couldn't really stop them from doing that. And then there's the Cuban Missile Crisis, where the Russians put in nuclear missiles into Cuba and pointed them at the United States, which would only give the United States a few minutes to react to a nuclear missile strike. And I think he probably tap danced through that fairly successfully, but nonetheless, that was no doubt very stressful for John F. Kennedy. So when it gets to Vietnam, John F. Kennedy is thinking to himself, okay, this is it. We're drawing the line in the sand at Vietnam. We're going to hold Vietnam, and we're going to start getting some momentum for the forces of freedom, because it had been the communists like pushing the whole time through his early years of his presidency, or what he thought would be the early years of his presidency, because as we all know, he was killed in 1963 by Lee Harvey Oswald. Well, anyway, that's going to be enough for today, so we'll probably shut this down. I'll have some other stuff out for you guys this week. Bye-bye.